Apex Metal Solutions dumped damaged roofing tiles in her backyard for 14 years. She started a company. Sarah Mitchell never imagined that the greatest burden of her life would come in the form of rusty metal sheets, silently dumped, one by one, over 14 years, at the back of the property she had helped build with her own hands. Each pile that grew in her yard was a fresh insult, but also proof that someone, on the other side of the wall, was counting on her exhaustion. What the factory didn't bank on was that Sarah Mitchell didn't know exhaustion, and that the very material they discarded as trash, she would one day use as the foundation for something no representative, no lawyer, and no amount of dollars could erase. The noise came before everything else. It was in early September, when the heat was still deciding whether to stay or leave, that the first heavy trucks appeared on the dirt road leading to the edge of Sarah's property. She was inside, taking clothes off the clothesline, when she felt the vibration in the ground before she even heard the engines. She stopped. She looked at the brick wall separating her property from the neighboring area, and then she heard the unmistakable metallic sound of heavy machinery being installed. Back then, Sarah was 42 years old, with blonde hair that the farm country sun had left with natural golden highlights, and light blue eyes that people said oddly matched her straightforward way of facing problems. She wasn't the type to back down, nor the type to wait. But that September, when the metal processing plant set up on the edge of her property, she still believed that things get resolved when you talk. Her husband David was the first to downplay it. "A factory is a factory, Sarah. Jobs for the town. You'll see, it won't be any trouble at all," he said, without taking his eyes off the newspaper in his hands. "David, they're 3 feet from our wall, 3 feet. Do you know what that means with the wind coming from there? It means you'll need to sweep the sidewalk more," he replied, letting out a short chuckle that she didn't find funny. The next day, Sarah went to the small town's town hall, a small town tucked away in the countryside, with an uneven cobblestone town square and low-roofed houses that carried decades on their walls. She asked about the factory's permit, about setback rules, about what was planned for the disposal of production materials. The receptionist was friendly, jotted everything down on a slip of paper, and said she'd pass it along. Sarah left her name and phone number. The call never came. The weeks went by. The factory grew with an impressive speed. Where there once was an empty lot covered in grass and some old fig trees, an industrial shed appeared, then another, then fences and gates and trucks coming and going all the time. The noise of the machines became the permanent soundtrack of Sarah's afternoons. She learned to ignore it. What she couldn't ignore was the first dump. It was a rainy morning, a heavy grey October, when she went out to the yard and found, on the other side of the wall, a strange pile. She climbed onto a wooden bench she used to reach the service area roof and peered over. On the other side, thrown in total disarray, there were at least 20 metal roofing tiles, some bent, others with edges raised like poorly opened iron flowers, all covered in rust that wasn't recent. She got down from the bench. She stood still for a moment, looking at the wall. Then she went back inside, picked up her little black notebook she used to jot down measurements for the sewing she did for the neighbors, and wrote down the date, time, and what she had seen. It was a habit her mother had taught her. Write everything down, because memory forgets, but paper doesn't. The next day she went to the gate of the factory. The guard was a young guy who looked like he had been placed there with very little training. Sarah calmly explained the situation. She asked to speak with someone in charge. The guard wrote down her name on a piece of paper and said he would let them know. No one called her back. She went 3 times that month. On the 3rd time, she managed to speak with a yard supervisor, a middle-aged man named Stan, who listened to her with the expression of someone who had already heard too many complaints that week. "Ma'am, that material was temporarily stored there while we organized the space inside. It'll all be removed by the end of the month," said Stan, with the tone of someone who believed what he was saying, or at least wanted her to believe it. Sarah jotted down the date of the conversation, the man's name, and the promise he had made. The month ended. The tiles were still there. It turned into 2 months, then 3. Then in February of the following year, a new batch appeared, bigger than the first. She wrote a formal letter, handed it in at the gate with a receipt signed by the same young guard. She kept the copy. She waited. Nothing. Those were the first months of a habit that Sarah cultivated for 14 years. Complain, document, save, wait, and watch the backyard slowly be swallowed up by someone else's decision. Life inside the house was changing quietly, the way important things usually change. David found a job in a larger city about 50 miles away and started spending more time away than at home. At first he came back every weekend, then every 2 weeks. Then, one day, he came back to pick up his big suitcase and said things weren't working out, that he needed a different life. Sarah stood still at the kitchen door, a dish towel in her hand, watching David load his bags into the car. She felt a huge pain in that moment, the kind that rises up through the throat and wants to turn into crying but can't, because dignity blocks everything. She didn't ask him to stay. She didn't ask if there was someone else. She simply said, "It's okay. Take care of yourself." And she closed the door before the car left the yard. Her children, Taylor and Ethan, still lived at home back then. Taylor was 18 and had the same determined attitude as her mother, except she decided things by shouting while Sarah decided in silence. Ethan was 15, quiet like a Saturday afternoon, and spent most of his time with his school friends. They both felt their father's departure in different ways, but neither of them experienced it out loud. It was a family that had learned that problems are carried inside. Sarah started doing sewing work for neighbors to supplement what was left from the arrangement with David. She had a knack for the sewing machine, and a small town always has someone with a hem to sew or pants to adjust. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep the house running without having to ask anyone for help. And Sarah valued that a lot, the ability to get by without depending on anyone. Taylor left home when she turned 20, went to study business administration in a larger city, and promised to come back on holidays. Ethan went in the same direction 2 years later, found a job in another state, and the visits became more spaced out. Sarah stayed. That property, with its backyard that the company kept insisting on turning into a storage lot, was everything she had built, and she wasn't going to leave anything she had helped build. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like, and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot who are just starting out. Now, continuing. With the children gone and the house too big for just one person, Sarah began to notice even more the small details that had previously gone unnoticed. One of them was Mr. Arthur, the retired blacksmith who lived about 1.25 miles from her property, down the dirt road that crossed the Harrison farm. She had known him by sight for years, knew he had worked in metalworking for nearly 4 decades before retiring, but had never had reason to exchange more than a passing greeting. Their first real conversation happened on a Thursday, when Sarah stopped by the side of the road to help Mr. Arthur push a wheelbarrow that had gotten stuck in a ditch. The man was about 65, with broad shoulders that told the story of a lifetime of manual labor, and a slow, deliberate voice that always sounded like he was thinking twice before speaking. "These roadside ditches are the ruin of my plans," he said, looking at the wheelbarrow with disgust. "Let me see," Sarah said, and without further ceremony she bent down, examined the wheel fitting, and gave a sharp blow with the palm of her hand to the bent part of the axle. The wheel snapped back into place with a click. Mr. Arthur looked at her, surprised. "You know about metal?" "I know about solving problems," she replied. From that day on, they started greeting each other with more words. Sometimes he would stop by her fence while walking along the road in the afternoon. She would offer coffee. He would accept without fuss. And it was on one of those afternoons that Sarah told him the story of the backyard, not to ask for a solution, but because it was too heavy to keep to herself. Mr. Arthur listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a while, staring into the backyard with that expression of someone calculating things most people can't calculate. "Can I take a look at that material?" he asked finally. She led him back there. He walked among the piles of roofing tiles with a careful slowness, crouching every now and then, tapping certain sheets with his knuckles, tilting his head to hear the sound they made. "There's a lot of usable stuff here," he said, almost to himself. "Usable how?" Sarah asked. "Surface rust. Most of it has good structure. With the right treatment, half of this could turn into quality building material." Sarah stared at the piles with new eyes for a moment, but then shook her head. It wasn't time yet. She still believed the legal battle would solve everything. She still believed justice would arrive before she had to fend for herself. But justice, she would learn, has its own rhythm. And that rhythm doesn't match anyone else's. The years passed with the cruel constancy of things that don't change when you want them to. The backyard was taken over in layers. First the edges, then the middle. Then the area Sarah had set aside for a vegetable garden that never came to be because of lack of space. The piles of tiles grew in height and spread, and with each new batch she documented everything. She photographed them with a simple camera she kept in a kitchen drawer, wrote notes in her little notebook, delivered a letter to the factory's reception desk, and kept the copy with the stamped receipt. Mrs. Martha, her neighbour to the right, became an involuntary witness to the whole saga. She was an elderly woman with white hair and a sharp wit, who had planted a rose garden along the fence dividing their properties, and who swept her own sidewalk every day with a meticulousness Sarah found almost religious. "You're cataloguing those tiles like someone organising a stamp collection," Mrs. Martha said one morning, peeking over the fence with an expression that was half amused, half concerned. "I am. Because someday someone will have to answer for this, and I want to have the answer ready," Sarah said. Your mother was like that too, you know. She saved everything, even grocery receipts from 10 years ago she kept. She taught me. Your mother was stubborn in the good way," Mrs. Martha said, "the kind who wins by wearing you out." Sarah smiled with the corner of her mouth. "Then I'm on the right track." But beneath the smile was a weariness she didn't show anyone. It was the kind of tiredness that doesn't come from physical labor, but from carrying an injustice for years without seeing any movement. Every time she looked at the overrun backyard, she felt a mix of anger and sadness that she had learned to manage by turning it into action. She went to the registry office, sent letters, took photos. It was the only way she had to transform powerlessness into something. It was in a march of fine rain, in the 9th year of the illegal dumping, that the first real sign of change appeared at her door. The young man who knocked on the gate was around 30, wearing a polo shirt, carrying a leather briefcase, and holding a form with colourful tables in his hand. He said his name was Justin, and that he worked for a regional environmental assessment firm, hired to conduct a survey on industrial waste disposal around factory units in the countryside. Sarah looked at him with the distrust of someone who had been ignored many times before. But there was something in the young man's direct manner that made her open the gate. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked. "No, I'm going through all the properties in the area. If you don't have time now, I can come back." "No, come in." She led him straight to the backyard. She didn't introduce anything, didn't give context, didn't explain a thing beforehand. She opened the gate to the back area and let him see for himself. Justin stood still for what seemed like a long time. He walked slowly between the rows of stacked tiles, looking to the sides, up, at the factory wall. Then he stopped and looked at Sarah with an expression she had never seen on anyone else who had visited the property. It was genuine surprise. "How long has this been here?" he asked. 9 years, but if you want documentation, I've had it since day one." He looked at her with a different kind of attention. "You have documentation from all 9 years?" "I do. Photos, letters, records, dates, everything organized by year in a binder." Justin pursed his lips, then let out a low whistle. "I've never seen this before," he said. "Most people I visit just give a verbal complaint. At most, a photo on their phone. But it's a dossier," Sarah finished, without modesty. "It's a dossier," he agreed. She got the binders. There were 4, each with an elastic band and a year label written in pen. Justin spent over an hour flipping through the material, photographing page after page with his phone. When he left, he said the report would be forwarded to the appropriate authorities and that she could expect a response. "How long?" Sarah asked. "I can't promise a timeline, but your case is solid. The documentation is exceptional. I know it's solid. The question is how long it takes for someone besides me to see that." Justin left with the binder of photos and the expression of someone who had seen something they didn't expect to find. Sarah closed the gate, went back inside, and made coffee. She sat at the kitchen table with the cup in her hands, looking out the window at the front garden, where a jasmine plant she had planted years ago had grown crooked, but kept blooming every season. She didn't know if Justin would come back. She didn't know if the report would go anywhere or be forgotten in a file drawer, but she knew that someone, for the first time in 9 years, had looked at all of that and fallen silent in astonishment. And that silence for her was worth more than words. The factory's response came 3 weeks later, not from the environmental survey, but directly from management. A man in a grey suit she had never seen before knocked on the door. He introduced himself as Mr. Sterling, the company's institutional relations advisor. He had an easy smile and a handshake that was too firm, the kind meant to convey confidence before he even opened his mouth. "Mrs. Sarah, we're here because we learned there was a survey done on your land, and we'd like to talk before any misunderstanding sets in," he began, after she invited him in and put water on to boil for a coffee she had no intention of offering. "There's no misunderstanding," she said, sitting across from him. "There's a documented fact. You've been dumping industrial material on my land for 9 years. You need to understand there was an internal communication failure," said Mr. Sterling, with the same calm tone of someone who had rehearsed the line. "Those materials were temporarily allocated by a department that misjudged the property boundaries. It wasn't intentional." 9 years is a long time for an unintentional mistake, Mariana replied. Sterling opened the folder he had brought and placed a paper on the table. It was a compensation proposal. The amount was written in the center of the page, underlined. Mariana looked at the number. It was less than what it would cost to hire a service to remove all the material. "That doesn't cover the removal costs," she said. "The company would commit to handling the removal." "Within what time frame?" "To be agreed upon." Mariana folded the paper in half and handed it back to him. "So I'm not signing anything that says to be agreed upon. Not with the history I have with you people." Sterling sighed discreetly. He put the paper away. "Do you have a counteroffer?" "I'm not here to make an offer. I'm here to receive what's fair," she said. "Full removal of the material within a set deadline and compensation for 9 years of unauthorized use of my land. Documented, signed, with a date." Sterling left without reaching an agreement. He came back 2 weeks later with a slightly higher amount and the same vague deadline. Mariana refused again. On the 3rd visit, he was accompanied by a lawyer, an older man with thick glasses and a worn leather briefcase, who called himself Mr. Thorne. The lawyer tried to explain, using terms Mariana didn't know, that the company would have the right to contest part of the claims based on technical aspects of property law. Mariana let him speak until the end. Then she said, "I understood every word, and I have a letter sent by you 7 years ago saying the material would be removed in 30 days. That's technical too." Mr. Thorne looked at Sterling. Sterling looked at the table. The meeting ended without an agreement. That night, Mariana called Taylor. Her daughter answered the phone with that voice of someone always in the middle of something else, but this time, when Mariana explained what had happened, she was quiet for a moment. "Mum, you need a real lawyer. You can't keep trying to handle this on your own anymore." "I know," said Mariana. "Do you know anyone?" "Let me ask a colleague. She told me about a lawyer there in your town. They say she's good." "Good at what?" "Good at not giving up." Mariana thought that was exactly the kind of lawyer she needed. The lawyer's name was Catherine Vance, and she worked out of a small office on the 2nd floor of a townhouse on the main street of the nearby town, about 25 miles away. The room was simple, with bookshelves up to the ceiling and a dark wooden desk that looked like it had stories to tell. Catherine was about 45, with short, dark hair, and a way of listening that made people feel like every word was being carefully weighed. Mariana arrived with 4 folders under her arm, and 2 more she had organized in the years following Justin's survey. She placed everything on the table without saying a word. Catherine opened the first folder. She was silent for a few minutes, flipping through slowly. "Who organized all this?" she asked. "I did." "Did you work as a legal assistant?" "I do sewing." Catherine looked up from the folders and gave her a look that Mariana couldn't quite figure out. It was a mix of respect and something almost like cautious surprise. "There's grounds for a civil lawsuit here," said Catherine. "Removal of the material, reparations for damage to the land, possibly compensation for the period of unauthorized use." "How long?" "A case like this can take 2-3 years, sometimes longer. Depends on the judge, the company's response, the expert evaluations. I've already waited 11 years. 3 more don't scare me." Catherine signed the representation contract that same afternoon. The lawsuit was filed on a Monday in April that started with sun and ended with rain, as if the weather itself didn't know what to feel. Sarah signed the papers in Catherine's office, tucked her copy into her usual folder, and went home the usual way, stopping by Mrs. Brenda's bakery where she had a coffee she hadn't ordered, but Mrs. Brenda placed in front of her as soon as she saw her walk in, because in that small town, people still recognized the face of each other's exhaustion. The factory's response to the lawsuit came 40 days later and was hefty. Mr. Thorne had done his job efficiently. The defense argued that part of the material had been deposited with tacit consent, since Sarah had never taken legal action in previous years. It also argued that the documentation she provided had limited evidentiary value because it was produced unilaterally, and it raised technical questions about the actual ownership of the boundary area between the 2 lots. Catherine read everything calmly, then called Sarah. "They're trying to create noise," the lawyer said. "It's tactical, but their response has a problem." "What?" They responded. And by responding, they acknowledge that the material exists and that there's a relationship between the factory and it. That alone eliminates outright denial. So that's good? It's the bare minimum. Now comes the slowest part. The judge will order a technical inspection of the property. The inspection took 4 months to schedule. The expert, a quiet and methodical engineer named Victor Price, arrived one morning in August with an assistant and measuring equipment. Sarah followed them every step of the way across the backyard, not rushing, not trying to impress, just walking alongside and answering questions precisely. When Victor asked how she knew a certain batch of tiles had arrived in a specific period, she opened her little black notebook and read the entry aloud, with the date, the time, and a description of the material's condition that day. Victor looked at the notebook. Then he looked at her. "How long have you been doing this?" "Since the first deposit." 11.5 years. Victor spent 2 more hours on the property than scheduled. His report was submitted to the court 6 weeks later. Catherine called as soon as she received it. The report is favorable. It confirms irregular dumping, estimates the total volume, assesses the damage to the soil structure and usable area of the property, and concludes there's no evidence of any form of consent from the owner. Sarah sat down in the nearest chair when she heard that. She was quiet for a second. "And now? Now we request a hearing. With this report in hand, their position is very weakened. There's a real chance of a settlement before it goes to trial. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and hit like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out." Now continuing. The hearing was scheduled for the end of October. Sarah began mentally preparing herself for it, as if it were the final stretch of a very long walk. She knew it wouldn't be easy, that the company still had resources to delay, to appeal, to request new evaluations. But for the first time in over a decade, there was something concrete in front of her. A date, a time, a room where someone with authority would have to hear both sides. That was when the phone rang at 10 o'clock on a Wednesday night. It was Catherine, and the tone of her voice already said the news wasn't good before she even opened her mouth. Sarah, Apex Metal Solutions changed hands. The silence that formed on Sarah's end lasted longer than it should have. "What do you mean?" "The company was sold to a larger corporate group. The new management filed a motion to suspend the process, claiming they're not responsible for liabilities prior to the acquisition. The judge agreed to examine the issue before proceeding. The hearing was cancelled." Sarah closed her eyes. "How long to sort this out?" "It could take months. The process of reviewing legal succession isn't quick." "Months." She repeated the word as if testing its weight. "I understand this is very frustrating," Catherine said. "But the case hasn't been dismissed. It's suspended. There's a difference." "I know the difference," Sarah said. "I just don't know if it makes much difference to someone who's waiting." She hung up the phone carefully, placed it on the table, and sat there in the dark kitchen for a long time. The refrigerator made that usual noise, a low, steady hum she normally didn't hear because she was used to it. That night, it seemed very loud. For the first time since she had started this whole fight, Sarah Mitchell felt the ground giving way beneath her feet. It wasn't anger. It wasn't despair. It was something hazier and heavier, the feeling that the accumulated effort of 11 years was being diluted by a bureaucracy that didn't know and didn't care who she was. She went to bed without dinner, and she woke up before the sun, as always. The next morning she went to the backyard, not to write anything down, not to take photos. She went because she needed to see it all in the daylight, with the sun coming in from the east and hitting the rusted sheets in a way that made them gleam strangely, as if the metal still had something alive inside. She walked among the piles with her hands in the pockets of her leather apron, that old one that had belonged to her father, and that she wore when doing heavy work. She stopped in front of one of the tallest piles. She just stood there looking. Then she remembered what Mr. Arthur had said years ago on that afternoon over coffee that now seemed to have happened in a different life. Surface rust. With the right treatment, half of this here turns into quality construction material. Sarah picked up a sheet from the top of the nearest pile. It was heavy. She braced it against her thigh and tapped the center with her knuckles. The sound was solid, clean, without the hollow ring of something that had lost its structure. She picked up another, same thing. Same. She picked up a third, this one with heavier rust, and tapped it. The sound was different, a bit hollower in one corner. She set it aside. She spent the next hour doing this, testing sheet by sheet, separating those with solid structure from those that were compromised. When she finished, there were 2 piles, a smaller one for actual disposal and a larger one, surprisingly larger, of material that sounded like intact metal. She went inside, washed her hands, drank some water, and picked up the phone. "Mr. Arthur?" she said when he answered. "Do you still have those metallurgy tools?" The pause on the other end lasted only a second. "I do." "Why?" "I need you to teach me something." Mr. Arthur arrived that same afternoon in shorts and a plaid shirt, with a canvas bag full of tools that he carried with the familiarity of someone who had never parted from a trade. He examined the 2 piles Sarah had separated, tapped on some sheets with his own method, adjusted her classification on 3 pieces, and said she had an eye. "You mentioned the right treatment," Sarah reminded him. "What treatment is that?" "For surface rust, there are several ways. The most accessible is a weak acid solution. You apply it to the sheet, brush it, rinse it. The surface rust comes off. Then you apply a coat of anti-corrosion primer and the material looks good as new. Well, almost new, but ready to use. Where do I find this acid? At the hardware store. It's not hard to find, not expensive. The problem is the work. It's labor-intensive, Sarah. I have time. And equipment. You'll need at least a sturdy workbench, steel brush, protective gear, gloves, goggles, and apron. "I already have an apron," she said, looking down at what she was wearing. Mr. Arthur smiled. "We'll find the rest." They went together to the town's hardware store the next day. Sarah bought only what was essential within her budget, nothing beyond what was necessary, with the cool-headedness of someone who knows she can't waste anything. Mr. Arthur brought some tools he had kept since retiring, among them a small bench vise and a set of steel brushes in different sizes. The first batch of sheets took 3 days to process. It was hard work, with her arms aching and her shoulders complaining at the end of the day. But when Sarah saw the first sheet come out clean, straightened, and with the coat of primer applied, she stood still for a moment before continuing. There was something in that she hadn't expected to feel, a physical, tangible satisfaction, the kind that doesn't come from filling out forms or waiting for a response from the registry office. "This has real structure," said Mr. Arthur, tapping his fingers on the finished sheet. "Someone could use this on an actual roof." "I know," said Sarah, "and I know someone who needs it." The idea of selling the material didn't come from a plan. It came from a casual conversation with Mrs. Martha, who was sweeping the sidewalk when Sarah passed by with the wheelbarrow full of treated sheets. "Where are you going with that?" asked Mrs. Martha. "To sort them by size. I'm going to see if I can sell them." Mrs. Martha looked thoughtful. "My son needs roofing for the renovation on his farm's roof. He says buying new stuff is too expensive." Sarah stopped the wheelbarrow. "How much is he paying at the hardware store?" Mrs. Martha named a price. It was well above what Sarah had calculated she could charge for the recovered material. "Tell him I have good material here. Lower price. He can come take a look." Mrs. Martha's son showed up 2 days later, a man in his 40s with a straw hat and the look of someone who assesses land and construction in one glance. He examined the sheets carefully, tapped on them, held one up to the light, bent one edge slightly to test its flexibility. "Good material," he said. "How much?" Sarah gave the price. He didn't haggle. He bought 8 sheets, came back a week later with his brother-in-law and bought 16 more. Before leaving the second time, he said, "My neighbor needs some too. Can I give her your contact?" Yes. There was no sign, no business card, nothing. But word of mouth in a small town doesn't need a sign. In the 3rd week, Sarah put up a simple poster, handwritten in pen on a piece of cardboard, by the dirt road that ran in front of the property. It read, "Recovered roofing, fair price. Ask for Sarah." She didn't know that poster was the start of something. She thought it was just a way to get by while the process was stalled. But sometimes what seems temporary is exactly what was waiting to become permanent. The call from the new management of Apex Metal Solutions came through their lawyer in a formal letter 3 weeks later. The content was clear. The company had learned that the owner of the neighboring property was selling material belonging to the company without authorization. They demanded an immediate stop to the sales and the return of the material. Sarah took the letter to Catherine the same day. The lawyer read it, reread it, and then did something Sarah didn't expect. She smiled. "They made a mistake," said Catherine. "What mistake?" "By claiming ownership of the material, they are formally acknowledging that the material is theirs, and if it's theirs, they're responsible for the illegal dumping. The new management can't inherit the company's assets without also inheriting its liabilities." Sarah stared at the lawyer. "So by trying to stop me, they incriminated themselves." "That's pretty much the gist of it." Catherine replied to the letter formally with surgical precision. If the company acknowledged ownership of the material, it was consequently acknowledging the illegal dumping and taking responsibility for the damages caused over the years. The new management had 48 hours to reconsider its position, or the correspondence would be added to the case file as additional evidence. The company's response didn't come in 48 hours. It came in 51 over the phone from Mr. Thorne himself, with a tone much less confident than in previous meetings. "The company wants to resume negotiations," he said. "Great," Catherine replied. "Then let them do it in court." The lawsuit was reactivated. The hearing was rescheduled for February, at the start of a year that arrived with heavy rain and a drought of news that made that month feel particularly long. Sarah went to the courthouse with Catherine, wearing a blue blouse and dark pants, her folders all organized under her arm as always. The hearing room was small, with cream-colored walls and an oval table where the judge, a man in his 50s named Judge Miller, sat with the case file piled in front of him. The lawyers spoke one at a time. Catherine was concise and direct. Mr. Thorne was wordy and tried to sound technical. The judge listened to everything without changing his expression. In the end, Judge Miller looked at the papers, then at Sarah, then at the stack of documentation that had been presented. "The documentation for this case is among the most thorough I've ever seen in a neighbor dispute," he said, without a tone of exaggerated praise, just as a factual observation. "The expert report is clear. The responsibility for the illegal dumping is established." The verdict was handed down weeks later, in writing. The company had to remove all remaining material from Sarah's property within 90 days and pay compensation for the damages caused to the space over the years. The amount was modest, enough to cover the legal costs and a small renovation on the property. It wasn't the number Sarah had imagined when she started, but it was real, it was concrete, and more than that, it was signed by a judge. Catherine called as soon as the verdict was released. "We won, Sarah." Sarah was silent for a moment on the other end. "I know," she said finally, and now I want to tell you something you don't know yet." What Catherine didn't know was that, while the case was dragging through the succession phase and the suspension, Sarah had sold over 200 sheets, that Mr. Arthur had developed a more efficient straightening technique with an adapted tool he built himself, that there was a building materials dealer from the neighboring town, a man named Raymond Patterson, who had shown up one afternoon in a white pickup truck, looked over Sarah's stock with professional attention, and made a distribution partnership proposal. "How much can you produce per month?" Raymond had asked that afternoon. "Depends on the batch available," Sarah replied, "but with 2 regular workers, about 80 to 100 meters of treated roofing." Raymond had done some mental math. "I can move all of that. I have clients all over the countryside who need good material at a fair price. If you formalize the business, I'll handle the distribution, and you provide the product." Sarah had listened to everything. She had asked questions. She had asked for 2 days to think it over, and she had called Taylor. The call to her daughter had been different from all the others. For the first time in many years, it wasn't a call about the lawsuit, about the factory, about the exhaustion. It was a call about a possibility. Taylor had stayed silent, listening to her mother explain. When Sarah finished, there was a pause before the reply. "Mum, are you telling me you built a company while waiting for justice?" "It wasn't quite like that. It was exactly like that. I just needed to do something with the material that was there." "Mom," said Taylor, with that voice of someone trying not to show emotion but not quite managing it, "every company starts with someone who needed to fix something. You built a company." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, feel free to hit the like button and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. Taylor came back on a Thursday in March by car with a medium-sized suitcase and a folder full of spreadsheets she had made on the work computer over the past few weeks. She arrived without giving the exact time, and Sarah was in the backyard when she heard the engine noise. She walked around the house to the front yard and saw her daughter getting out of the car. Taylor was 32 years old and had inherited her father's height and quick thinking, and from her mother, the stubbornness and practical sense she was still learning to recognize in herself. She hugged her mother tightly, then stepped back and looked straight at the backyard, at the makeshift shed where 2 sheets were being treated by Sarah and Mr. Arthur. "This is actually working," said Taylor, not as a question. "It's actually working," Sarah confirmed. They sat at the kitchen table that night, with Taylor's spreadsheet spread out among coffee cups and a plate of cookies Sarah had made that morning. Taylor had calculated the production cost per sheet, the margin at the price Sarah was charging, the scaling potential if there was enough material, and what would be needed to formalize the activity as a company. "You're going to need an accountant," said Taylor. "I know. And a formal registration before closing the deal with Raymond." "I'm aware of that." "And you'll need more people. You and Mr. Arthur can't handle it if the volume increases." "I've already thought about that. There are 2 guys from the neighborhood who need work." Taylor looked at her mother for a moment. "You've thought about all of this?" "I've been thinking about it for months. I just needed to put it on paper." "Then let's put it on paper." They worked until almost midnight. It was the first time in many years that Sarah and Taylor had sat at the same table working together on something. And there was something about it that neither said out loud, but both felt. It was different from the relationship they had when Taylor still lived there. It was an adult relationship, equal to equal, with the respect that comes from seeing each other face to face without the filter that daily closeness sometimes imposes. When Taylor went to sleep in the room that still had some of her teenage posters on the wall, Sarah stayed alone in the kitchen for a while longer. She looked at the spreadsheets, at the numbers, at the projected margin from Taylor that, if everything went as expected, would make the business sustainable in less than a year. She had spent 14 years waiting for someone to solve a problem that had been created without her permission. And while she waited, she had solved the problem with her own hands. The lawsuit had been won, it was true. But the victory she was feeling that night wasn't from the lawsuit. The formalization wasn't simple. The accountant Catherine had recommended was efficient but demanding. and there was documentation that needed to be tracked down, organized and presented in specific ways that Sarah didn't know. There was a week when the registry office system was down for 2 days, and she had to go back 3 times. There was a supplier of chemical products for the cleaning process that delayed an entire shipment and compromised a batch Raymond had promised to a client. Sarah called Raymond before he could call her, explained the situation honestly, and proposed an alternative date. Raymond was quiet for a moment and then said he trusted her. "You're one of the few people who calls me before I need to call," he said. "That's how I do things," she replied. The 2 young men from the neighborhood Sarah had mentioned to Taylor were named Caleb and Tyler. Caleb was 23, the son of a neighbor who had become a widow early on, and Sarah had known him by sight since they were both children. Tyler was 28, had worked at a sawmill that closed the previous year, and had a steady hand with tools. The 2 arrived on the first morning not knowing what to expect, and Mr. Arthur trained them with the patience and precision of someone who has dedicated his life to a craft and knows the best way to pass on knowledge is by example. Sarah watched them work and thought about how that backyard had changed. Where there had once been piles without order or purpose, there was now a sorting area, a treatment area, and a finished product storage area. The sheets had labels, the batches had numbers, the process had a rhythm, and she had an old leather apron that had belonged to her father, which she put on every day before going into the backyard, and which had accidentally become the uniform of everything she was building. The new management of the factory got in touch again after the ruling, this time with a different proposal. A new representative, younger than Mr. Sterling, and with a less rehearsed tone, called Catherine, proposing an extrajudicial settlement in addition to what the judge had ordered. The group that had bought the company wanted to settle the reputational liability associated with the case and was willing to offer additional compensation beyond what was determined in the ruling. Catherine presented the proposal to Sarah on a Friday afternoon, sitting in the same office as their first conversation, under the same shelves full of books. "The amount is significantly higher than the compensation from the ruling," Catherine said, "and they want the company to be mentioned positively in any public communication you make about the case." "I don't do public communication," Sarah said. "I know, it's more of a symbolic protection for their image." "And what do they want in return?" "For you to sign a statement that the case is closed and there are no pending issues." "With the total removal of the material?" "Included in the agreement. They commit to removing what is still on the property within 60 days. Sarah was silent for a moment. "Does the amount help me buy equipment?" "Yes, comfortably." "Then I accept. But I want the removal deadline in the contract, with a penalty if they don't comply." Catherine made a note. "Of course. And I want the signature of the legal representative of the new management, not the advisor. I'll insist on that." The contract was signed 3 weeks later. Sarah kept it in the same folder where she had stored everything from the start in the last divider, behind all the others. With the settlement amount, Sarah went to the larger hardware store in the neighboring town and bought real equipment. A small sheet metal straightener, a bench grinder, and a complete set of protective gear for all 4 workers. She asked for everything to be delivered on a Saturday so Mr. Arthur and the 2 young men could be there when it arrived. Taylor had stayed an extra week to help organize orders, and she was also there when the delivery truck pulled into the yard. Caleb unpacked the straightener with the care of someone holding something they never expected to have access to. Mr. Arthur walked around the machine, touched the adjustments, and checked the manual that came in the box. Tyler was already connecting the cable before the machine was even fully in place. "It's going to be different now," said Mr. Arthur to Sarah in a low voice. "It was already different before. It'll be even more so. With the new equipment, production time has been cut in half. What used to take 3 days now takes a day and a half. The quality is more uniform, more professional. Raymond, when he saw the first batch come out with the new process, spent more time than usual on the property, examining the sheets with that merchant's eye of someone who knows what he can sell. This can compete with new mid-quality material," he said, "at 1/3 of the price." "I know," said Sarah. "You'll have a waiting list in 2 months. Then the distribution needs to keep up." "It will." The company was registered on a Tuesday, at the same registry office where Sarah had gone so many times in previous years with complaint documents. She signed the papers, received the official registration, and went home. She didn't throw a party. Taylor had suggested a dinner with everyone, and Sarah had said yes, they would do it. But first she needed to go to the backyard. Taylor went with her. The two walked through the workspace, now organized with a clarity that contrasted with everything that place had been in previous years. Caleb and Tyler had already left. Mr. Arthur had left early to attend to an appointment. The backyard was quiet, with the smell of metal and machine oil and the late afternoon light hitting the stacked sheets with labels and numbers. "Are you happy?" asked Taylor, in a voice different from the spreadsheets and contracts. It was a daughter's voice. Sarah thought about it for a moment. It was a question she rarely asked herself. "I'm proud," she said finally. "I don't know if it's the same thing." Taylor was quiet for a moment. "For me, it's better." The dinner was in Sarah's kitchen, with the extended table she used on birthdays, and that had been stored away for longer than it should have been. Mrs. Martha came wearing a floral skirt and brought a dulce de leche she had made herself. Mr. Arthur arrived in a new shirt and with a slightly uncomfortable demeanor of someone not used to celebrations. Caleb and Tyler came together, in jeans and with the same shy posture of people who aren't quite sure if they belong in that circle, and who were immediately put at ease by Sarah's simple way of including everyone without fuss. Catherine, the lawyer, came as a surprise. She said she was passing through town and had stopped on impulse, which everyone knew wasn't entirely true. She brought a bottle of wine that ended up forgotten in the fridge because the party had guarana soda and passion fruit juice that Mrs. Martha had made in enough quantity for a party twice the size. David called that afternoon before dinner. Sarah saw the name on her phone screen and stared at it for a second before answering. He had found out, through Ethan, that something big was happening on the property. He asked vaguely, with the tone of someone who isn't quite sure how to ask, without seeming like he should have asked before. "Things are fine around here," said Sarah. "The company was registered today." "Company?" repeated David. And there was something in his voice that Sarah recognized as real, unpracticed surprise from someone who had underestimated someone else for far too long. "Yes. I have to hang up now. I have people over." She hung up without malice and without ceremony. The phone went into her pocket. Dinner was served. The 60 days of the agreement with Apex Metal Solutions came to an end on a Wednesday. The big truck showed up at 8 in the morning with 2 workers and a supervisor carrying the printed work order. Sarah received them at the gate with the contract in hand, opened the back area for them, and stood there as they began the work of removing the remaining material. It was little compared to what it had been. Most of it had been sold. What was left was what had no usable structure, the most compromised sheets she had set aside from the start as scrap. But there was enough that the truck would need 2 trips. The supervisor, a guy who must have been around 30 and clearly didn't know the history of the place, asked her to sign a pickup confirmation form. Sarah signed it. She handed the pen back. The guy folded the paper, put it in his folder, and went after the workers. In the gap between the first and second truck trips, Mrs. Martha showed up at the fence with a cup of coffee in her hand and a look that said she wanted to witness the moment without seeming to be witnessing it. "It's all going away," she said. "Yes," said Sarah. "How are you feeling?" Sarah stood looking at the area the truck had emptied. The ground was marked, the earth compacted by years of heavy piles with darker spots where the weight had been greater. But it was clean ground. It was her land again. "Good," she said. "I'm feeling good." When the second truck left, Sarah was alone in the yard for a while. Caleb and Tyler hadn't arrived yet. Mr. Arthur would come later. Taylor was working from inside the house on a call with Raymond about next week's orders. She walked to the center of the space. She stood there, in her leather apron, hands in her pockets. The morning sun was coming in from the east and hitting the roof of the shed she had built with the first recovered sheets, bending the light in a way that made the metal gleam with a color between gray and gold. Inside the shed, there was a batch of 40 finished sheets waiting for delivery. There was the new straightener, clean with the cord neatly coiled, There were tools hanging on hooks that Mr. Arthur had installed on the wall with the meticulousness of someone who respects the craft. There was a corkboard with orders organized by date and client, which Taylor had set up before heading back to the city, with colored post-its that Sarah didn't fully understand but had learned to follow. There was, in short, a business, small, rooted in that marked ground, built with the hands of people who had met without a plan around a problem no one had asked for. Sarah stayed there for a few minutes, listening to the silence of the empty yard for the first time in 14 years. Then she heard Taylor's voice inside the house, ending the call with a "locked in then, you can confirm the order." She heard the noise of the street gate, which was Caleb arriving with Tyler on the back of the old bicycle. She heard, farther off, the slow footsteps of Mr. Arthur coming down the dirt road. She took a deep breath. The ground was marked but firm. The fence had been rebuilt. The shed smelled of clean metal and serious work. And the lot, that piece of ground she had defended for 14 years with letters, photos, notebooks, and a silent stubbornness that no one had been able to break, was completely hers. Not just on paper, in the sense that every inch had been reclaimed, transformed, and filled with something she had built when no one was watching. What Apex Metal Solutions had dumped as scrap, she had turned into a foundation, and from that foundation, she had built something no truck could ever take back. Caleb tossed his helmet onto the bench in the shed and asked what there was to do today. Sarah turned to him. "There's a batch of 60 sheets waiting for sorting," she said. "Let's get started." And she went inside. End of the story. This was a story of strength, stubbornness, and transformation. Now tell us what you think. Do you believe Sarah was right to never give up? Leave your opinion in the comments, leave your like, and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories that will touch your heart.